The Symposium, Presidential Power, Foreign Affairs, and the 2012 election. We've had tremendous panels this morning from several presenters. Panel 1 on presidential power in a war without end, and panel 2, the War Powers Resolution at 40, still controversial after all these years. I hope you enjoyed your lunches. We're ready to begin the afternoon session with a roundtable on rendition and targeted killings of Americans, chaired by Professor Robert Strassfeld from here at Case Western Reserve. Bob?
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I don't have to introduce myself because Michael did that for me. And I will introduce the panelists very quickly. Again, in the interest of time, you have in your materials full biographies, or fuller biographies. They actually all have very long biographies, and I refer you to them. But starting closest to me is Professor Jeff Addicott at St. Mary's University. To his right is Professor Amos Guiora, used to be my colleague, now from the University of Utah. To his right, Professor Leila Sadat of Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. And to her right, Professor Milena Sterio of Cleveland Marshall College of Law down the street from us. The panel sort of immediately agreed to disregard the title of the roundtable in the program. So I just, not to leave you disappointed at the end, let me tell you up front, we will not be talking about renditions on the theory that there is plenty to talk about with regard to targeted killings. I suppose since you've been lured here with rendition in the title, if you want to ask a question about them, you can try. I mean, we will have been talking about targeted killings, just keep that in mind. And the title suggests that we're talking about just targeted killings of Americans. I think we will touch on that, but the panel will address the topic more broadly. Let me say one thing about nomenclature. We've already heard this morning some discussion about whether to use the term drones or RPVs, remotely piloted vehicles. Nomenclature actually matters. I mean, you may hear similarly both international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict, depending, I mean, there are reasons why people choose those terms. My reason for using the ones that I will use are basically, that was the term I first heard and first learned, so I will call RPVs drones, and I might have occasion to refer to IHL law. But hear whatever pleases your ears when it comes out of, I mean, people do care about the terminology, but I intend to offend nobody. Okay, we'll see if I can stick to that. So I want to start by asking the panelists, and some of this will look like College Bowl, the toss-up question. Why is it that some countries, most notably the United States, but others, find the use of drones attractive? What is it about drone warfare, which we were told again this morning that the face of warfare is changing, the nature of warfare is changing? What are the attractions of the use of drones, and what are the risks and drawbacks of their use? And I'll let any panelist who chooses to go for it. Milena?
Sure. So I think the biggest advantage, or the claimed advantage, of using drones is the fact that we're not sending American troops anywhere. We're not using our Army, our Navy, our Air Force. So there are literally going to be zero American casualties. That is the biggest claimed advantage. There's obviously a flip side to that, which is to say that war has really become completely dehumanized. And so now we have these drone operators located in places like Nevada or Virginia or who knows where, literally pushing buttons to launch these deadly weapons, which obviously can be a huge problem. So I'll keep my remarks brief for now. I'll let the other panelists chime in, and then we'll
Jeff?
I think one of the things that I see some old timers in the room. Remember during Vietnam, we had no good news in Vietnam, so we had the body count. So all the public was fed was body counts because there was no way to win the war in the minds of many people. During the Bush administration, you didn't see body counts on TV. Today, if you notice on the Obama administration, the phenomenon is you watch the ticker tape, whether you're watching MSNBC, drinking the Kool-Aid, or watching Fox News, you'll see
There's no
four
Kool-Aid on
terrorists.
Fox?
No. Well, they're a little liberal too. 4 terrorists killed today, 7 killed here, 8, because there's no good news in Afghanistan. We have lost the war in Afghanistan. So the only good news they can feed us is these, puffed up body counts. And you'll notice that phenomenon is occurring more and more. And as we know, President Obama has killed far more people by drones than President Bush under his administration ever dreamed about.
Anyone else? Leila?
Well, what are the advantages? I think Milena stated them, essentially, that you have a zero casualty use of force. What I think it might be important to distinguish, though, is drones are used in different conflicts for different reasons, for different purposes. The title talked about targeted killing of Americans, which maybe we'll come back to at the end. That's a very specific issue with respect to the targeting of al-Awlaki, who was referred to this morning. But the controversy regarding the drones, I might just throw this out and then we can talk about it in the Q&A, or maybe Amos has some comment. It's, first of all, are they lawful under the laws of war? That depends on where and how you use them, right? And the second is, I think one of the audience members raised the issue of the morality, the ethical nature of what we're doing. Drones raise particular moral and ethical questions because they are remotely piloted. They can be used in a way that doesn't put the user at risk. And so Peter Singer has said they remove essentially the last political obstacle to war because you don't actually have to have this conversation. So maybe I'll just throw that out for more discussion.
We're actually, you've now raised several things that I want to get to, and have in part responded to the question, well, what are the downsides? What are the risks? Any other downsides worth mentioning?
So, by those who don't know, by way of introduction, I served for 19 years in the Israel Defense Forces, and during the course of my career, I was involved in targeted killing decisions. So when we've been back and forthing about what to discuss today, I thought it would be valuable to the audience to have, very briefly, because we're time limited.
Actually, my next question.
Oh.
So go ahead.
A segue, right? About how actually these decisions are made, and where my concern, based on my experience, and where my concern is with respect to the Obama implementation of drones, targeted killing, any other alphabet soup. What you need to know, for those of you who have never been involved in this, that for drones to be legal, moral, and effective, they absolutely must be based on criteria narrowly defined with a narrow definition of legitimate target. And for those of us who have been involved in actual targeting decisions, when we read carefully Brennan's talk or speech last year at Harvard, where he recommended a flexible definition of imminence. If I had any hair left, my hair would have stood straight up, but because I have no hair, right? But I will say on a very serious note, with all due respect to Mr. Brennan, that speech was arguably one of the worst speeches ever given in the name of national security of the United States of America. Because by recommending adoption of a flexible definition of imminence, it means there is no narrow definition of legitimate target. It means that everybody is a legitimate target. And Leila's absolutely right, and I read very carefully your terrific speech from last weekend. Emphasizing the morality of drone policy is an absolute essential. It cannot be viewed only through the lens of the law. It must be viewed through the lens of morality. Because if there's no legality and no morality, then it's obviously not going to be effective. And Jeff mentioned we were standing outside of an invaluable point. Drone policy that doesn't meet tests of morality, legality, and effectiveness, and not narrowly defined, what you've done is nothing more than create the next generation of terrorists. The blowback is enormous. And in the context of the negatives, if the Obama administration continues the way it's going in terms of this extraordinary collateral damage, CIA denials aside, take us all back to last September when the CIA leaked to the New York Times. New York Times never lies. I got the laugh, okay? CIA leaked last September, and I quote, "There is no collateral damage in the Obama policy, in the Obama drone policy." Okay, take a deep breath.
Yeah, let me comment on that.
Hang on. Those of us who've been involved in targeting decisions know, as Anderson Cooper said this week, but in a different context, that is what is called an alternate reality. It's just incorrect.
Yeah, what I was going to amplify what Amos is saying. It's like if I shoot an arrow into that wall, the Obama administration then goes up with a magic marker, they draw a circle around the arrow, and they said, bullseye again. They never miss. And well, how do you know it's a bad guy? Because we killed him. I mean, that's exactly really no collateral damage. Any weapon system that man has ever created has collateral damage, which is fine. The law of war recognizes the concept of collateral damage, but please, stop the nonsense. Of course we have collateral damage. Now, as far as morality, that's a slippery slope. I mean, we firebombed Tokyo with incendiary bombs. You want to talk about morality and the number of dead? So this is nothing new. Oh, well, this is immoral. It's not an immoral weapon. It's a good weapon, but it has to be used in a right way. There's a lot of issues, and I'm not going to. We'll get to the next issues. But I just want to amplify. That's the logic. It's like I shoot an arrow in the wall, draw a magic marker, never miss.
But any number of us would say that the firebombing of Tokyo was highly problematic.
Oh, it's illegal,
These
immoral.
days it would be considered a war crime. Let's be real.
So would
But
Dresden.
I'd like Amos to say a little bit more. I mean, two countries in particular are identified with drone warfare, the United States and Israel, although the Russians have also reportedly used drones, and others are preparing to. As Amos said, he has experience in the targeting decision. Can you say a little bit more about the differences between the Israeli approach and what we know? And part of what we know is how little we know about the U.S. approach in targeting decisions.
So I wear obviously two hats here. I mean, I'm an American law professor, but also obviously based on my experience in the IDF. When we began the policy years back, it was essential, instrumental, to have narrow criteria of who indeed is a legitimate target. And we were well aware of the fact that obviously the policy is controversial and raises all kinds of legal questions, which we could discuss until your hair looks like my hair. We don't have time for that.
Forbid.
That's kind of charming. The point of the exercise, and to be serious here, is that the criteria of who's a legitimate target is something that we spent a significant amount of time on. And there were a number of different principles attached to that. One, to be extraordinarily cautious and sensitive to collateral damage. Two, to ensure that the target, indeed based on intelligence information and a careful reading of intelligence information and a careful reading of who provided that intelligence information, indeed presented not a past threat, but a future threat. And three, to ensure that the activities that the person was involved in were serious and significant enough to justify killing him. Those three principles, narrow definition of legitimate target, absolute minimization as much as possible of collateral damage, and ensuring a careful analysis of the intelligence information to ensure that's you're not killing him because of a past act, because if it's a future act. Those three very strict, specific definitions, yes, it takes a while to get, to work it all out, to implement it. And remember, in this business, there's no vacuum. While we're considering what policy to implement, we're the subjects of suicide terrorism. I mean, it's not happening in a vacuum, and it's not some vague academic exercise. But I would suggest that those three very specific instructions, if you will, it would behoove the American administration to, again, adopt them narrowly and specifically.
Well, I'm sitting to Amos's right, but I might. Well, am I here? I'd be probably on your left a little bit here, at least politically speaking, in the sense that I think I agree very much that our policy isn't very effective. But I actually think that where I pushed, I would think even the Israeli policy wouldn't be something I'm very happy with. I think the legality issues are really a lot more serious. I don't think it's only a legal issue, and I think it's too big an issue for lawyers to decide alone. But I do think the legality of the strikes in Pakistan, for example, are seriously problematic, and the casualty levels are in the thousands. It has actually been reported. I heard a lot of comment this morning about, Obama administration supporters not really taking this issue up. It's been on the front pages of the New York Times. Jane Mayer has written the same kind of journalism in the New Yorker that she wrote about rendition. Academics have been penning articles. I'm not sure why it hasn't gotten the political traction that it has, but I think there has been serious commentary. I think maybe Milena wants to jump in.
So as to the legality of the drone program, to conclude that the drone program is lawful, and to get then to the next issue of under what circumstances, which of the drone strikes are lawful, you first have to get to this issue of, are we in a true armed conflict? If we're in an armed conflict, who are we fighting against? Under the Bush administration, we were in this global war on terror. Now we're in a war against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces. So again, we really are at war, against whoever wants to be designated as a target. So it hasn't really been clearly defined as to, who are we really fighting against? And there's a good argument, and this really hasn't been in the news as much, there's a good argument to be raised that, maybe we're at a war against Al-Qaeda, but not really against the Taliban, because the Taliban, they were fighting in Afghanistan, they were fighting to control Afghanistan, they wanted control over the Afghan territory, but they weren't really fighting a war against us. I mean, you could certainly make the other argument, but I think with respect to the Taliban, there definitely are some questions as to whether we're really at war against them. If you conclude that we're not in an armed conflict against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or anybody else, then under human rights law, international human rights law, the drone policy becomes unlawful per se, because under international human rights law, the object of your operation cannot be to kill somebody. Some casualties are allowed, but the object cannot be to kill. So one question is, what is this armed conflict? Who are we fighting against? Then the other issue is, well, where's the battlefield? If we're in an armed conflict, where's the battlefield? Leila raises an excellent question as to the location of the strikes. The strikes in Yemen, for example, are we really at war with Yemen? We're not at a war against Yemen, but the argument has been that wherever our targets are, that's where the battlefield moves. And then finally, and I'll leave time for the other panelists for this, but if we conclude that we're in an armed conflict and then we get to this issue of IHL, then we get into the nitty-gritty of the circumstances under which each particular drone strike becomes lawful or unlawful. And here the problem is that we don't really have the information to assess that. These are, most of the drone strikes are conducted by the CIA, and we don't really know, who they're targeting, where they're targeting, what the casualties are. So those are all hugely important questions that I don't think have been discussed adequately.
So this is a hard question to ask the panel without giving them 10 minutes to leave the room and sort of caucus, but I'll try it anyways. Are there consensus circumstances under which drone strikes are lawful that all of the panelists would agree to, and then also consensus circumstances under which they're not lawful, and then obviously there's going to be a middle ground? And to what extent does it matter which law is the applicable law? So I'm letting you out of the room.
The rule of law,
and
part of the problem with the war on terror, terrorism is a tactic. It's not a war against terror. It's not a war against all terrorist groups. It's a war against a very specific enemy combatant, and our Military Commission Act first really defined that very well in 2006. It said Al-Qaeda, Taliban, associated forces. That language has been picked up by federal court cases. It was amplified a little bit in the 2009 Military Commissions Act, but the premise is correct. If we're not in a state of war, then the only other legal basis would be in self-defense, and we've done that under the Reagan administration, where we have, launched. President Clinton, for example, launched cruise missiles into Iraq, and that we weren't at war, but he was acting under the inherent right of self-defense. So there is another gray area. I do accept the premise that we're at war. I do accept the premise that this war, there's no hiding place. I get a safe base in Yemen. No, the war is global. The authorization for use of military force had no geographic limitations on it. So if we're at war, then it's perfectly lawful that we can use these types of weapon systems. There's other collateral issues. For example, civilians may support military efforts, but they cannot engage in offensive operations. What troubles me in some cases is, do we have civilians, and maybe that's another question, engaging in violation of the law of war? I'm more concerned with the policy issues. As Amos said, I think we're creating more enemy combatants / terrorists, whatever term you want to use, but enemy combatants, than we're killing. Because, you kill one and the other 9 members of the family may have been more or less ambivalent. Now it's on. We're joining. And plus, the vast majority of people that we're killing, the Obama administration puts out, well, it's the top leadership, the top lieutenants. No, it's not. That's a lie. The vast majority is Schmudlap. That's, everybody has a gun, and Schmudlap is going from point A to point B, and he's killed. So no, that's not the vast majority. That's not true. But I do accept the premise that we're at war. My greatest concern is the policy that's the reason that we're doing this. But I do accept the premise that we're at war. It's a global war against Al-Qaeda. When's the war over? Well, when the executive branch says it's over, the Congress says it's over, the Supreme Court, none of them have said it's over. It's not up to me as a pointy-headed law professor to say, well, the war's illegal, the war's over. That's my opinion. But our leadership, those 3 branches, they got us into this, and they will get us out of it one day. I don't know when that day is.
So,
Go ahead, Amos.
in Israel, the term of art we came up with, which is a made-up term, it's called armed conflict short of war. And then if any of you have a better term than that, would be welcome, because I'm not exactly sure what armed conflict short of war means, other than it's armed conflict short of war. And the justification for the targeted killing, which we call targeted killings and not drones, has been from the very beginning aggressive form of self-defense. And Jeff's right to highlight the point of self-defense. In terms of when it's lawful in the context of self-defense and armed conflict short of war, what I think is important to emphasize, again, going back to what I said earlier, is you have to have really sound intelligence information. You have to make sure that the source is not engaged in some kind of a vendetta with respect to the person he's identifying. You have to understand the language. You have to understand the culture. I have, in parentheses, grave concerns about our intelligence gathering with respect to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and God knows where else. And you have to ensure that the person poses such a significant enough threat that it's, in the context of self-defense, justified to kill him. And if it is not posing that kind of a significant enough threat, then no, it's not justified. And Jeff's right. Everybody who's killed is either the top commander or the deputy commander. And in real life, right, I mean, Jeff and I served in the military. It's just not everybody's a commander. Not everybody's a deputy commander. I mean, not everybody's the chief. There are Indians in this business. And if you have not, again, what I said earlier, I want to emphasize this, a narrow definition of a legitimate target, all you're going to do is have extraordinary blowback. And the best research on blowback is written by a professor of operations research at Yale University. His name is Ed Kaplan, and it's the best empirical work, not law type stuff, but actual empirical work on the blowback of drone policy, and I highly recommend it to everybody.
Well, you asked a very specific question, right? Which is, can it be cabined? Are there situations of clear legality or clear illegality? We used drones in Libya, which was an armed conflict, obviously, authorized by the Security Council. I don't think the question about legality is answered by the AUMF, with due respect. That's a constitutional authorization. With respect to Libya, the president entered that pursuant to Security Council resolution. The question is answered by international law. It's really the issue of whether we're at war or not at war is not something the United States just decides on its own. We do for domestic constitutional purposes, but the 192 countries in the world also have an opinion as to what the definition of an armed conflict is. All of us are parties to the Geneva Conventions. So the classic answer is that any use of force, any weapon, is lawful if used during an armed conflict, assuming that it's proportionate, the use of force is proportionate to the threat, and that the use of force respects the principle of distinction, meaning that it distinguishes between those actively participating in hostilities in an Article 3 conflict, the non-international, or combatants is the general word. I think in the terrorism context, the use of drones is almost, I won't say always, but almost always unlawful in my mind, because in general, it's being used against suspects in far-flung countries who I don't think under ICRC definitions would actually count. Some of them would, Some of them would. But the problem, I think this goes to Jack's point this morning, we haven't created a rule of exception where particularly dangerous individuals who were unable to capture under very limited circumstances, maybe we could sort of wince, I would wince, and say, we'll authorize a targeted strike. In fact, this has become the rule. The exception has completely swallowed the rule, where anybody who the Obama administration, or prior to that, the Bush administration, thinks might, if you read the newspaper, is terrifying as a lawyer. Terror suspects, jihadists, Islamic radicals, insurgents. You can read the kind of language applied to these individuals and just sort of shudder when you think that every one of them is about to be vaporized. Right? Vaporized. This is not a light decision. And the casualty levels are so high now that, is it lawful, is it not lawful, maybe isn't actually the right question anymore. And that's why I throw it out. Personally, I would have drawn the line 11 years ago in a different way. I lost that fight, and we still talk about the unlawful enemy combatant. But I think at this point, we're beyond sort of the niceties of legality, and we're into an area in which U.S. policy is creating huge blowback, to use Amos's words.
So Leila read my mind with respect to the first half of her remarks. I was just going to point out the same thing, that basically the question really is one of international law, whether we are in a true armed conflict. Yes, constitutionally speaking, we have the AUMF and the courts and everything, but as international law professors, it troubles me to only talk about the domestic constitutional portion of this. I think, international law, plays the most important role here. The other thing that I would mention, your question, to go back to your question about the types of strikes and sort of when they could be legal, when they wouldn't. So we have reports that the CIA has used two types of strikes, so-called personality strikes and then signature strikes. Personality strikes are strikes where you target a specific person, and those presumably would be sort of similar to what Amos was speaking about when he talked about the Israeli policy. If you're targeting a specific person, you have specific information that says that person is a commander, is a chief, not an Indian, then possibly you could say that's lawful. However, when we use what's called signature strikes, we basically target an area based on intelligence reports of suspicious activity. And suspicious activity can mean people moving around, something that looks like a camp, but it could be a civilian camp. It could be refugees going back and forth. And so those strikes, I think, are highly problematic and unlawful.
If I can just follow up, that's a great point. There was a report not denied exactly a year ago that from the perspective of the administration, someone in the, and I quote, someone in the milieu of a terrorist is a legitimate target. So I looked up in the dictionary what the hell milieu means. And it's
French.
It's French, right. Thank you. So I don't know if the person who was, leaked that, if he knew French, but I found it to be deeply disturbing, because what it really meant, frankly, is total guilt by association. And if you're in the vicinity of a terrorist, you're a legitimate target. And from the perspective of law, that's just blatantly illegal. From the perspective of morality, I know we disagree, that's absolutely immoral. And from the perspective of effectiveness, it's just not effective whatsoever. And this idea of these broadly used terms, milieu, it's a lovely sounding word in French, but when you think about it in the context of the decision maker sitting in wherever they sit outside Las Vegas, he's pressing on this and he's saying, well, milieu, right? It's just absolutely astonishing. And I need to add one more word where we disagree. I blame the American media. I think that the American media has provided the president with extraordinary cover. And a year ago, I met with a reporter, and we had the conversation, which I said, if President Bush had the same policy as President Obama, you guys would be bashing him. At which point he turned his back to me, something that hasn't happened to me, I think, since 4th grade. And when somebody turns their back to you, it tells you that you're right. Obviously, I struck a chord. And I think that the media has maybe covered it, but not critically. And the media needs to cover this far more critically than it is.
I'd say one last point. When my colleagues talk about international law and their eyes get all flowery and stuff, I'm a nationalist.
Wait a
And I make no mistake about that. First of all, when you talk about international law, what international law body says that we're acting illegally? Is it the Security Council? No. Is it the European Court of Human Rights? No. What is it? It's somebody's opinion that you're acting outside of what I think international law should be. And that's fine, you can have an opinion, but it's not in violation of international law because you say it's in violation of international law. We have 3 branches of government, and they have clearly said that we are at war. The United Nations, a third of the members are totalitarian, bloodthirsty regimes. Why in the world do I care what they think about the price of tea in China? I don't. They will sign any document and turn their back on those. I'm not concerned with that stuff. Are we doing the right thing under our rule of law? Absolutely yes. So as a nationalist and a unabashed nationalist, I am very happy with the fact that it's legal what we're doing. I don't like the policy issues, but how are we going to substitute our opinion for what the president and his advisors determine is an enemy combatant? We can't have law professors sitting up there and the public opinion deciding, oh, this is the right person, this is the right person. We elect these people to do that job. We can unelect them if we don't like it.
It is I mean, to paraphrase Marbury against Madison, it is the province of law professors to opine on.
Oh, you
what
can
the
opine,
law
but don't try to impress people that that is the law. I mean, that's an
Maybe,
opinion.
Jeff, one of the issues, though, is you may not like the fact that international law might apply, but the strikes are not occurring in the United States of America. The strikes are occurring on the sovereign territory. Well, that's a different issue. But the strikes occur on the sovereign territory of other states, right? They're occurring in Pakistan, they occur in Afghanistan, they occur in Yemen, they occur in Somalia, Iraq, and Libya.
Sudan.
As far as we know. So to the extent that other states' territory is being struck, that's a violation of their sovereignty unless they consent. Just as if Mexico was flying drones over the United States and hitting us, we'd be pretty upset about that. That would be an invasion of U.S. airspace.
But it's not a violation of international law.
Let me finish, actually.
Or drone attacks
A
here.
violation of sovereignty is a violation of international law unless there's something either the state has consented, so Yemen has consented. Pakistan, in order to get their consent, we have allowed them to designate the targets in some cases, which raises another whole host of where is our intelligence coming from and are we doing someone else's dirty work for them? And that's a huge issue. I assume there's some limits on the global war on terror, and if one of these individuals was found in Sweden or Canada or Mexico, we wouldn't think it was lawful to go forward. At least the Brennan speech suggests if we could capture, or those states are states we trust or believe would do something, then we wouldn't exercise our right. But I think there are limits to U.S. action and projection of power in the world that are imposed by the fact that we live in a world where other states are sovereign like us.
I have a question. What about Nazi Germany? Could they go to a country and say, oh, this is our safe base, you can't attack us because you would violate the sovereignty of this country? Of course we can attack them wherever they go. Now, we can violate the sovereignty of that other country, but have we violated the law of international law of armed conflict, law of war? No. We can take that up with that country, but there's no safe place for the Nazis to hide and say, well, you can't attack us in this country. Then that country is either with us or against us, and we're acting under the law of war, which supersedes these other international obligations.
But just to follow up on the 2 points before they kill each other, right, is,
I'm not going to respond.
really quick, the question is when we're doing, as Leila correctly said, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, or Yemen, God knows where else. I would argue that we're violating the sovereignty of these countries, and the question is, in terms of policy, is there a narrow definition of why we're killing somebody? Does he pose a threat to American national security? I have not seen, in terms of the after-action reports, particularly compelling analysis and reports with respect to each and every person who's been targeted, whether or not they posed an immediate future threat to American national security. And I find that deeply troubling.
But if they're an enemy combatant, you don't have to demonstrate that they're going to pose a future threat. The president says they are.
Let me deliver on the promise that will include Americans as targets in the discussion. So we know of one instance of an American specifically targeted, 2 other instances of Americans dying as collateral damage, even though that apparently doesn't happen. Does that raise a different level of question, or is it all the same?
If the premise is that we're at war, You can't avoid being killed if you're an enemy combatant because I'm a U.S. citizen. During World War II, we killed a lot of U.S. citizens that fought for the fatherland. We even hung one by military commission under dear old President Roosevelt. He said, I'm a U.S. citizen, that's fine, have a nice day, we'll see you on the other side, and executed him by hanging him by the neck. What I found disturbing about Anwar al-Awlaki, I read the New York Times, and I seldom try to do that because I like to keep my breakfast down, but I read the editorial page. There were 6 letters of the editors. 4 of them said it was illegal. One of them says, I don't care, just kill him. And only one person had it right. They said, oh no, we're at war. He's an enemy combatant. The president designated him as such. Good kill. And I find that troubling that the schizophrenia that the Obama administration has started from day one has pushed down the American people. We don't even know if we're at war anymore. We are at war. I'm going to close Gitmo. No, you're not. I'm going to stop military commissions. No, you're not. I'm going to try these people in New York City. No, you're not. And that's the American people leading this president.
So let me just outline some of the things that our Attorney General Eric Holder stated regarding the targeted killings of American citizens. So in a highly anticipated speech in March of this year, Attorney General Holder said that basically we could kill American citizens through a targeted killing if the targeted citizen is located abroad, so we can't do it if the citizen is in the United States, if he or she is a senior operational leader of Al-Qaeda or associated forces, if he or she is actively engaged in the planning to kill Americans, if the U.S. government has determined that the individual poses an imminent threat of violent attack against the United States, if capture is not feasible, and if the operation would be conducted in a manner consistent with applicable law of war principles. That's a lot of ifs. To reach that conclusion that somebody, an American citizen can be targeted, that's a lot of ifs. The problem, Jeff talked about sort of we should trust our president and we can unelect him. For me, that's in this context of targeted killing, what's really problematic is basically the president is making all these decisions. The president is, the prosecutor, the judge, the jury of who gets killed where. And regarding Anwar al-Awlaki, the American citizen who was targeted and killed, basically there was a lawsuit involving that case where al-Awlaki had been placed on a hit list, and his father, through the ACLU, brought a lawsuit in New York, and ultimately Judge Bates dismissed the case, said it's a political question, right? So basically we're back to this issue of the president saying, who can be put on a hit list? They can be targeted. They can be an American citizen. To me, that's highly problematic.
Judge Bates, incidentally, in that decision, points out his discomfort with the fact that if it was a question of wiretapping al-Awlaki, there would have to be judicial oversight of something. But to kill him,
That's right.
Trust the president.
At the risk of tilting at windmills, but I'm a professor, and I guess I get to do things like that. That's all we get to do, right? The fundamental conceptual flaw in this whole thing starts 11 years ago. It didn't start 4 years ago. It starts with the creation of the quote-unquote unlawful enemy combatant category, which is an individual who is covered under the old memos that were issued in the last administration. They're covered neither by the Geneva Conventions, that is, they don't have the rights of POWs, they don't get to surrender, they don't get that kind of treatment, and they don't get covered by U.S. law or human rights law because they're treated as unlawful belligerents. I think that conceptual flaw, which is, I can see that I'm shocked that the Obama administration continues to cleave to that precedent. I think it was wrong-headed 11 years ago. I think it's profoundly disturbing to create an entire category of human beings who are designated by the executive in his sole discretion as individuals covered under no protections whatsoever, either of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, or U.S. constitutional law. I find that conceptually, that's the legal black hole. You heard that in the last administration, Guantanamo being a legal black hole. That continues essentially to be the rationale. So the argument that we can kill anyone who we designate an enemy combatant, even if he or she is on the territory of a state with which we're not at war, clearly we're not at war, and even if that individual is not about to perpetrate an imminent attack, I find shocking. And I think it's that conceptual flaw that we've been stuck with for 11 years and that our courts have sort of implicitly blessed, but I can still write my law review articles criticizing, that has given rise to a situation in which the usual rules that limit excessive government power, even during wartime, even during wartime, have been completely dissolved.
What's interesting, if not disturbing, to follow up on Leila's great point, is we're 11 years after 9/11. And we're having the discussion today as if we were 11 years back. You know, in the baseball paradigm, we're somewhere between the dugout and the on-deck circle. And it's deeply disturbing, I think, for all of us that from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, these key core issues have not been satisfactorily addressed, much less satisfactorily resolved. And I go back to the previous panel, which I thought was a terrific panel. There is this thing out there, as I understand it, called the Congress, right? No, there's not. That's right. And if you think about drones, and what you must understand, again, whatever term we call it, drones are the future warfare. This is the future. The tanks versus tanks and planes versus planes, that's passé. Drones is where we're going. And if we don't address, much less resolve these core questions, what you're going to see is high collateral damage and big-time blowback. And I want to thank Michael for organizing this panel. I mean, these are exactly the kinds of discussions that must be had. They must be had nationwide. And by the way, if you watch whichever convention you want to watch, I don't recall any discussion about drones. And that's very unfortunate, because this is the future of warfare. We have no choice but to resolve these questions, and not tomorrow, but today.
So Amos's point gets us back to something that Leila said at the very beginning, and I want to get you all to talk a little bit more about this. I'm a little bit skeptical that, I mean, yes, it is the future of warfare, but boots on the ground aren't going to disappear. Back during Vietnam, we heard about the electronic battlefield, and that was a long time ago, and we're not quite there yet. But it's clearly part of the future of warfare. And I wonder if part of the issue that we're not really talking about, I mean, Leila raised it, we're not talking much about, is whether or not drones make the choice to go to war too easy. One of the things that George Mason, I think it was George Mason, said at the Constitutional Convention was that the document was supposed to clog the path to war. Bob Turner can tell me if I got that right. Close enough? Okay. Are we clearing all of the brush by this kind of war light, or at least from the perspective of
it's war heavy, but
the people pushing the buttons, war light?
Well, so I just want to point out one other example. So using drones today is not the only time in history where there have been zero casualties on one side. And in particular, I'm thinking of the NATO airstrikes in 1999 on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. There were zero casualties on the NATO side, and, sort of, I don't know, 500 or 800 or 1,000 casualties, who knows, in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. So this is not the only time, this is not the first time that we've had zero casualties. However, I do think that the calculus as to whether to use deadly force has been skewed, has been tilted. And so when you know that you're not really risking the lives of your soldiers or anybody at home, the decision to use the deadly force, I think, becomes easier. That doesn't necessarily mean that drones should never be used. That's a totally different question. And I'm not suggesting that, those decisions are necessarily always made lightly, but I do think that those decisions are made a little bit easier. And just very briefly, I just want to go back to something that Leila just said, this whole category of unlawful enemy combatants. I was actually thinking about that yesterday as I was thinking of our panel today. And I just want to point out the sort of crazy asymmetry that exists there. We're basically saying somebody, if they're an unlawful enemy combatant, for the purposes of targeting, you're a combatant, but for the purpose, because if you're a civilian, you can't be targeted, but for the purposes of all the protections you'd be entitled to as a combatant, we're going to say, no, you don't get those. And the rationale for making that third category was, well, they don't play by the rules. Like, we're in a new kind of war, they don't play by the rules. And so instead of saying, well, we're going to play by the rules, we've said, well, we're not going to play by the rules either. And I think that's deeply troubling, and I think it's setting the wrong example for all the other countries in the world that may look to the United States for guidance on some of these issues.
The unlawful enemy combatant, though, is they're targeted exactly the same as a lawful enemy combatant. We don't target unlawful enemy combatants any differently than we target lawful enemy combatants. The only difference really is when we capture one, not when we kill them. We capture them, we can interrogate them as long as we don't torture or engage in any other self-imposed interrogation techniques. They're not entitled to the rights of a prisoner of war, but they're entitled to rights of Common Article 3. So by the targeting position, there's really no difference between an unlawful or a lawful enemy combatant. They can be killed whether they're eating, sleeping. In fact, that's the best time to kill them, was not shooting back at you.
I think we could get dragged into a pretty long conversation about that. The ICRC actually has guidelines and suggests that you have to be actually directly participating actively in hostilities. But aside from those...
By the fact that they're an enemy combatant, they're directly participating in the hostility. They can be sleeping, driving a car, eating lunch. They don't have to be shooting at you.
Right. Aside from that issue, which I think is a tricky one, Jeremy Waldron, the noted, I want to come, this is in my paper, but he has written a very interesting chapter in which he points out from a sort of moral philosophy perspective, our assumption is we're going to be the only ones using these weapons. And right, that's kind of our assumption, is we're the good guys and we're the only ones with these weapons. And so he says the problem is once you create a rule that you get to use these weapons against anybody who you deem to be, et cetera, sort of the bad guys or individual, other states who might not be your friends, or other countries, or the terrorists themselves might also want to use these weapons on the same basis. And I don't think it's pure speculation. There are 50 countries with drone technology now. China, Iran, right? Israel. Lots of other countries are developing these. Some of the drones, they've now written about tiny drones that can, this sort of sounds like the movie Dune, right? Where they fly in the window and they kill somebody. So I think I think we could debate the legal issues. I think it's a debate worth having, but maybe not today. We won't resolve it. There are obviously genuine differences, but these moral and policy issues loom really large, I think. Imagine 50 countries with these weapons ready to use them. And that's always true. States always, like military develops new weapons. That's what they do. And then they try to use them. But then the unintended consequences of that development is something that we all have to live with.
Bob, I want to go back to your question, which is an important question. I would suggest the following. Sleek technology is a honey trap. And we have to think, again, I repeat, sleek technology, it's a honey trap. And we have to be extremely careful in how to use it and when to use it. And I say that in the context of somebody who supports the idea of targeted killings and drone policy, provided there are a number of caveats imposed. We have to be extremely careful not to get caught up in this, that we're flying these drones that are somewhere in the air, CIA contractors, military, God knows whom else. And indeed, the person who's pressing on the button has no engagement with the person he's killing. It is a honey trap, and there's something alluring about it. And in the context of the broader debate, we have to ask ourselves, and I come back to the point of morality, and I said earlier I thought Leila's paper was a great paper, because emphasizing this idea of morality, you cannot, I know we disagree, but you cannot have this discussion about drones without asking yourselves what is the moral way to conduct, however we define the conflict and however we define who we're killing, without superimposing the question of morality.
So I have more questions, but I know that you do too, and I think it's time for me to bow out. And I can see
Unleash the dogs of war.
None of you have
more than a few
drones,
folks
right?
coming in.
I'm hiding behind you, human shielding.
Most of these incidents don't get adjudicated or inquired into in any way. The only one that was mentioned that isn't exactly a drone attack was Professor Addicott mentioning the attack by the United States in June of 1993 on the Iraqi intelligence headquarters in downtown Baghdad, which was based on the self-defense rationale, as Professor
Well,
Addicott.
and we had Sudan, the pharmaceutical plant. Clinton launched several attacks on.
Okay, all right, yeah, that's another. I don't have time to get into that one, but that one went to the Security Council. The United States complied with its obligation under Article 51 to make a report to the Security Council, arguing that it was self-defense, and there was a session of the Security Council
Afterwards, not
held-
before.
Yeah,
Wasn't prior to, it was after.
Not prior to, of course.
Have a nice day. So
Afterwards.
that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, Madeleine Albright showed slides at the meeting. She had slides of the circuitry in this alleged attempt, that is a bomb that was found in a car in Kuwait, and said that it was circuitry that one could tie to the Iraqi government, that it was particular kind of electrical circuitry that had previously been used somehow by the Iraqi government. And that was more or less accepted. There was the session ended after about an hour and a half, and no action was taken. I'm wondering, I'm wondering how you deal with finding out what happened in these situations, even after the fact, because in that one, subsequently, Cy Hirsch published an article in the New Yorker magazine in which he had managed to get this circuitry to 4 or 5 former FBI experts, all of whom said it was something you could buy at Radio Shack. And then the fellow who did the examination as the FBI agent, a guy named Frederick Whitehurst, subsequently went public and said, I'm the one who did the analysis in the FBI. I didn't say that it had anything to do with Iraq. I said quite the opposite. And somehow up the line between him, Janet Reno, and President Clinton, the report got changed to say that it was something that was actually connected to Iraq. I mean, how do you deal with that? I mean, and it was something that apparently within the Justice Department was phonied up by somebody along the line.
So if I can reframe the question, what accountability is there, and what mechanism for accountability is there, either before or more typically after the fact? Is that fair?
Maybe take a few questions
Bob,
and then let us
because of the sake of
respond.
time,
Okay.
Bob,
Yeah, sure.
the questions be really concise because we don't have much time.
I'll try to be concise. I'm trying to figure out what's different about drones than, say, gravity bombs. The gravity bomb pilot, he doesn't see the guy die. You have that same thing. You drew a distinction saying you can target the chiefs but not the Indians. Congress has said we're in an armed conflict. The Supreme Court has affirmed that. The UN Security Council has said the rights of self-defense apply, Article 51. So obviously they have felt this is an international armed, or this is a, sorry, non-international armed conflict. The one advantage of drones that nobody's touched on is you can have a drone hover over a target for 2 hours with 100 different monitors with people looking at it. And if somebody sees some school kids starting to walk by the target, they can say, hold off. If a CIA guy says, hey, third guy from the left is one of our deep cover agents, he's too valuable, don't pull the trigger. It's far better at reducing collateral damage than, say, artillery, gravity bombs, or many other weapons. So, you know, to me, a lot of what you're saying applies to any weapon system. And obviously, whoever said that the combatants don't have the right to surrender, that's absurd. Obviously, Common Article 3 applies, and Common Article 3 provides that anyone who's orders to combat, either from wounds or surrendering or detention, you know, has to be treated humanely. So I guess I'm sort of saying respond to those if you want to take any of them on.
I won't try to summarize. Come on down.
Sir? I'm just an attorney, but I have a question. Article 2 of our Constitution creates the office of the President. So we can amend Article 2 of the Constitution and eliminate the office of the President. So my question is, where in Article 2 have we elevated the office of the President to a deity?
Commander-in-Chief, he has the authority to make war. Those decisions are his decisions as executive. If he's wrong sometimes, you know, in war, there is no perfection, as in anything in life. Commanders-in-chief make bad decisions all the time, but the commander-in-chief has the authority to make these combat decisions, where to direct troops, how to direct them, when to direct them, charge that hill, don't charge that hill. Oops, that was done, we killed 20 people. We kill 20,000 people. You know, we do the best we can. I think the biggest problem I have is in asymmetrical warfare. There's no Berlin to capture. And that's why people, when's this war going to be over? You ever hear of the 100 Years' War, which acted over 100 years? My biggest problem is asymmetrical warfare. It's hard to identify victory. And my biggest complaint, if I can have 30 seconds, I'll talk real fast. President Obama last year with the killing of Osama bin Laden, God gave us victory on a silver platter. All he had to do is say, we win, you lose. The world would have bought that narrative. We could have got out of Afghanistan with victory instead. The new Taliban is going to join with the new what? And so when we leave, we lose, and now we're doing drones more and more and more to cover, in my opinion, his incompetence as a commander-in-chief. But there's a commander-in-chief. It's his decision. Do I think it's bad? Yeah, obviously you do too, but that's the commander-in-chief, and he's legal to do what he's doing.
So I've lost complete control here, but what I'll do is, and I apologize to Ben, he's a dear friend. One last question. All of them collected for the panel, and then we're out of here.
Senator Lieberman has introduced a bill, and there's a companion bill in the House to strip those abroad accused of terrorism, as designated by the President, of U.S. citizenship. It appears it has no political chance of passage on Capitol Hill. I wonder if you think it would be a good idea, and if so, what such a bill ought to include. Thank you.
So you remember all of those questions.
Maybe we start, Milena can start.
Yeah. I mean, I won't comment on, everything. So one thing to come back to, I think one of the first questions had to do with sort of how these decisions are made. Where I'm really bothered is that the approach of the Obama administration seems to be, the executive branch is going to make these decisions. Don't ask us any questions. Trust us that we're doing the right thing. And that Amos has talked about this. I mean, that is highly, highly problematic. I think there ought to be a very well-defined, crafted policy, even though, yes, our president is the commander-in-chief. But still, these decisions should not be made without very, very careful guidance. And again, I will come back to this issue of international law. Under the UN Charter, the right of self-defense is very, very specifically defined. And there are instances where force is used that do not rise to the level of armed attack that then triggers a nation's right to self-defend. So even in this context of claiming self-defense, I mean, Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell has written, I think, very persuasively that the right of self-defense doesn't really apply in this context. Now, that not everybody shares that view, but I think that's also another issue that ought to be debated more vigorously, today or at some other occasions.
I think what I would try to make the argument on the law is it is true that during a war, one has a choice of weapons, and one can use lots of different kinds of weapons, subject to the principle of proportionality and the principle of distinction. Where the legal foundations of this war are shakier, I think they're significantly shakier, is it actually an armed conflict in many of the places where the drone strikes are going on, and are these actually lawful targets? The U.S. has put forth a position that it is. The international community has, for the most part, pushed back and said, we don't accept that. Now, the U.S. can say, we don't care. We go it alone. This is our decision, and we do what we want. The difficulty is, and I thought Sandy made some great points this morning, is when we then go and we say, could you put a travel ban in effect, which is really better protection in some ways because they have to get to the United States to be a problem to us, right? Could you put an international travel ban in effect? Could you freeze assets? Can we work through the International Criminal Law Conventions to get extradition in cases where that's appropriate? The difficulty with taking it we go it alone approach is that when we need cooperation on issues that are important to us, it's much more difficult to achieve that. And I think as we get temporarily and geographically removed from the initial attack on us, right, which galvanized world opinion in our favor, the longer and further and farther we are from that incident, the more the United States looks more like a bully and less like a country that's a victim defending itself. And I say that's a perception, and one may not like that, and obviously the president has constitutional powers, but internationally it's very, very, very difficult. On the issue of the accountability, I'll just one point, there are efforts there's been a lot of journalism on this. David Rohde of the New York Times wrote an amazing set of articles on the, he was captured actually by the Taliban, and he was in Waziristan when drone strikes were taking place. And so he's actually written about what it's like to be on the ground. He then escaped, very courageous journalist. And he escaped, and he wrote about how terrifying the strikes were and how they were disrupting militant activities. There's a lot of website sort of efforts to put information in the public domain. It's very difficult because they're confidential, it's covert activity, but every time there's a strike now, statistics are uploaded to websites, and so you can actually get quite a bit of information.
Regrettably.
I'll be really quick.
No, let
All right, very quick.
Really quick. So I'm a fervent believer in terms of the law in self-defense. But with respect to the additional question of policy, by analogy, I take you back to headlines in the New York Times last September. Quote, Obama's foreign policy, not to have a policy. I think that is exactly what we're seeing with respect to the drone policy. And that, from my perspective, as I finish, raises deeply disturbing questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking the panel.